information here. But we can go ahead and start. Hi, Catherine.
Hello.
We're going to go ahead and start, and then as people join in, I will do my best to get them admitted quickly. Okay, so we're discussing Faithful and Virtuous Night by Louise Gluck. Gluck or Glick or Gluck or whatever you want to call her name.
It's Gluck.
It's what? Helga, you should tell us.
Gluck.
Gluck.
Yes.
Yes. With that umlaut. So that would have a particular sound. People, often people say glick. Yeah, okay. Well, so I always like to start with looking at the book as kind of like a piece of art in and of itself, and looking at how it's structured and the cover and acknowledgments and notes and all that stuff. And this book doesn't have a lot to talk about in that kind of arena. But what did you think about the cover? The cover actually is a photograph of Shanghai, Darkened Cities by a French photographer, Thierry Cohen. Anybody have any thoughts about that? I just want to start with this.
I actually thought it was Boston, the bridge outside of the, coming out of the airport and all that. I guess probably just because that's where she is or was when I met her.
Makes sense.
I saw the bridge more than I saw the road.
Yeah, you know, Sandy, I had written it over and over in my notes when I was reading the poems Mobius, or like her endings, the way she would kind of weave back and forth. So I hadn't even looked at the shape on here, but it's more of a spiral. But it kind of reminds me of the way she'll end so many of her stanzas with one idea, and then she amends it and splits with the opposite.
Yeah, I like that.
I definitely thought the cover took on a lot more significance after I finished reading the book. And I looked at it the second time and it was like, oh, at first I didn't pay much attention to it, but after the mood of the poems in the book at the end, you look back at it and you see something deeper.
Right. Especially since it's dark, you know, it's night, darkened. Yeah, I don't know why Shanghai. Maybe it's just something that.
I had a different.
What, Sherry?
What I thought about her poems was how far, in one moment, how far she seemed to travel before she would come back to the end. But coming back to the end, I always felt like I was somehow connected to back where we started, but we had gone so far. I don't anyway, for me, in many of them. So I look at when I started to look at the cover as a whole thing, I realized what's almost more beautiful to me is the back, and it's because of the light source that's
Mm.
up there in the sky
Yeah.
that illumine, and you can see it suggested right here. But it comes from that light source, whatever that. To me, anyway, that's just what I noticed. I love the back of it more than I love the front, actually.
Yeah.
Well, she talks so much, now that you've said that, she talks so much about darkness and light and how they contrast, even though the title of the book talks about night. There's a lot of that contrast, and she describes light in so many beautiful ways. One of the things that struck me about the cover was there's all this stuff hidden under the roadway, and there's the idea that night hides things, which for me was probably where the title Faithful and Virtuous Night came from, is because there's so much hidden at night. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always like to think that the cover is a conscious, choice, and it's not like a random photo someone puts up there. So I always try to find meaning in it. And then this book doesn't have any note. It doesn't have a dedication or any notes in the back, which I don't know, I kind of missed, but I always like to, I feel like I get a little bit of the poet when they include a little bit of extra material other than just the poems. But we don't get that here. We just go straight to the poems. And then there's 24 poems.
I was gonna speak to that. When I was getting my MFA, she came to speak to us, and because she lived in Cambridge, and we were told that she does not like to talk to people. She doesn't like crowds. And so we were told if we had any questions that we needed to write them down beforehand, and our professor would give them to her, and then she would come prepared to answer those questions, but she wouldn't take any questions while we were there. So I think, and I didn't even notice that there weren't notes or anything, but I think that speaks to her as a person, if she is still the same way as, when I met her in 2007 or 8 or whenever it was. But she's a very contained person.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense then. So she doesn't want to share a lot about her personal pieces. Okay.
Well, that's wonderful that there are 24 poems, because she talks a lot about the journey from day to night and back again, and of course being 24 hours in that time span. So, and there's actually, there's a lot of traveling. She talks a lot about circular gardens, circular voyages, and which fits with the circuitous looking cover, fits with that as well.
Right.
I didn't count the poems. I love that.
Yeah, that's cool. You guys are finding a lot of good meaning in here that I was kind of like, no, I don't know.
Well, and there was a lot of references to plane rides. And if you look at the cover, it's kind of like you're in an airplane looking down.
Yeah, that's, yes, very true. Very cool.
The time element too. Oh, there's one I'm not sure which poem it was now, but one where she finds herself in the middle of her life, and she is looking both back and forward, or trying to. Oh, there's another one that reminded me a lot of. Do you know Edna St. Vincent Millay's childhood is a kingdom where nobody dies? Know what important that is? There was almost an echo of that somewhere she said, "Mother died." I forget when. Mother died. Mother who never dies was the next line
Yeah.
there. And in a lot of it, it felt as though she was trying to look at connections. She also takes on a male persona quite a bit. And I think I remember, but again, I don't know where. Oh, in one of her books, I think I remember her saying that she should have been a boy. Um, and then there are other places, where the sister who died before she came becomes a kind of almost a doppelganger. Um, I've also wondered, did anybody think about the sword and the stone? Did anyone have any thoughts on that? In the eponymous poem, "Fateful and Virtuous Night," she talks about a brother reading at night and about the sword and the stone, and that's such an Arthurian quest motif. Um, so I was wondering if anyone had any ideas about that.
Yeah. We'll get to that. Let's get to that in a minute. Because that's a big thing. Just staying on with the kind of the structure of the book. In the poems themselves, what I noted were there are 8 prose poems. There are 4 poems with sections like 1, 2, 3, 4, however many. And then there's what I'm just calling other kind of normal-ish poems, 12 of those, 5 of which are very long, 5 or more pages. And the title poem has 10 pages is printed in this book anyway. So a bunch of longer poems. I remember when we talked about one time that I think it was Kathleen Lewis that said, "I don't like to read long poems." So maybe that's why she's not here.
Hey, me also. I'm going to
I
rat
was
her out.
Yeah.
But interesting. So I thought this book was not a book that you could read one time through and really say, okay, I got this book. I know what's going on here. This was a book that required, at least for me, study and continuous, let me go back and see how this poem is connected to this poem. And like reading the poems over and over again and trying to find a deeper connection with them than what I would first get if I just read it one time.
Andy, that's true for me for all of her work. I can read but that's not saying that somebody's a light poet when I can read it once.
Right.
It's just, I find the images and the themes, I can't just do it once.
Right. Agree.
Very intense.
It
That's
seems
because it rewards rereading.
It does.
Yeah.
That's true.
she so skillfully braids what seems to me to be like almost just a stream of thought, and then she ties in a story, and then it's back to the sort of just a stream of consciousness, and then there's another story, and it takes a while to really connect to it. But I have to say, it reaches me on a really deep level. I felt a real connection with the way what she expresses, what seems to be her view of reality and life. I really connected with the work.
Mm-hmm. Well, as someone was saying, so she takes on this persona, and like we know that when we're reading a poem and the speaker is I, first person, that it's not necessarily the poet. Like we know that, right? But still, you kind of like the first time through, you're like, okay, let me figure out like who is this speaker. And it became clear in the title poem, Faithful and Virtuous Night, that this speaker was not a female. Towards the end of the poem, it actually says, I became a boy like my brother, later a man. And then this persona, this character, shows up over and over again as almost a continuation of this story throughout this book. And I counted at least 7 poems in which this character, who is British, a painter, and a gay man, shows up in this book, kind of woven in between these dreamlike prose poems and then these other poems about aging and death and family and trauma and all this kind of stuff. So that was really, really fascinating, but it took y'all like major reading and dissecting to figure that out.
Yeah.
I'm probably slower than you guys are, but what did you think about that? What did you think about that? Did you pick up on this character like showing up over and over again and the continuation of this story?
I saw the character reappearing, but I didn't connect all the dots really until you just said that. So, it was still like a work in progress. Now I read it through once, and then I've studied poems some, but I didn't devote a whole lot of time yet. But yeah, it's still working its way through my brain, and I'm trying to figure out this. And I need another couple of readings for sure.
Yes. So I'm thinking these poems, starts with Faithful and Virtuous Night, and then Cornwall, definitely that same character. Afterward, Midnight, Sword in the Stone, Approach of the Horizon, and the White Series. These are all that same character's voice.
I kept thinking it would turn out to be someone we knew or ought to know, it would be, some famous artist. And it never was.
Right, it's fictional. And so after I kind of got puzzled about what's happening in this book, I did read an interview with her in Washington Square Review, where she talks about this, and then it really clarified a bunch of stuff. And she said that she had done all she could. She had written all she could on this subject of aging and approaching death and family trauma. And she needed another person's brain to continue that creativity. And she wanted to write about those subjects, but she didn't want it to be her own life. She needed it to have a personal grounding, so she made up a character. Fascinating, isn't it? And at first, the painter, the male gay painter, was at first a child whose mother took in sewing, and she wrote all these poems about sewing, and then was like, no, that's not right. And then changed it to what she has now. I'm just like, okay, that's just striking and amazing to me.
I think it's like she's a novelist almost. And there's so many poets that really aren't storytellers in this way. And this is so broad and vivid that, well, whoever it was a minute ago that said you need another reading, we could study this for a long time. I mean,
exactly.
It's just, for it to be such a short volume, it's full.
Yeah, it definitely is. And even one of the poems, which I thought was really super interesting. So in Cornwall, which is the second poem with this character, and talks a lot about silence, the very next poem is almost a continuation of this previous poem. The first part of Afterward, reading what I have just written, I now believe I stopped precipitously, so that my story seems to have been slightly distorted, ending as it did, not abruptly, but in a kind of artificial mist of the sort sprayed onto stages to allow for difficult set changes. She's continuing the story into the next poem.
I love that idea that she needed a different voice to enter. And for me, that explains kind of this floating feeling I had in that faithful and virtuous night. Like I couldn't tell quite where I was. And it's almost like she's arriving at the anchor character and lets us see some of that in the poem. But it's so haunting. And I'm like hungry to know more about that. So as I'm reading the poem, I'm looking for the anchor of that character and what happens later. And 7 years in therapy, oh my gosh, like, and then going to live with his brother later. It's like haunting and pulls me.
And having a romantic relationship with his nephew. All right. But I'm curious though. Yeah, Sherry.
Got a question because obviously I need another read through of this. I've only read through it once. I've read several, more than several, probably half of these poems 2 or 3 times. So I'm learning so much from listening to some of you, but what I also had a sense of, and I wonder if anyone else did, and if it could be true, I sort of had a feeling in some of these poems like she didn't know where she was going to be going. She's finding it as she's on the page. She's following something.
Mhm.
And then it's almost like, it got out of sight. And then, so she had, I don't know, so she turns this way and then goes this way. Does that make any sense what I'm saying? And does
Yeah.
anybody have that feeling? It was.
And not only with direction, but with time. As
Yes.
Alice was saying before, the weaving in and out of time. You don't know what's present and what's past or future. So
Right. And weaving in and out of character.
Mhm.
The whole thing is this big movement, this big
Mhm.
shift in movement.
Yeah. Which makes the circuitous thing on somebody pointed that out to even make more sense. But for me, I have to tell you, A Horse and a Rider, I read right before I got in the saddle this weekend, and I was so moved. I ended up reading it to everyone that I was riding with when the ride was over, because it was so, I just was, anyway, completely blindsided by the end of it. Anyway.
What
Yeah.
poet wouldn't want that though?
Yeah.
You know, you read a poem to everybody, whatever crowd you were in.
And the horses.
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah.
and the horses. Yeah.
I'm going to Kroger. I'm going to take this book with me.
Actually, The Horse and the Rider inspired me to write a poem, because when I was at Sandy's a couple of weeks ago, we couldn't feed the horses, and it still stuck in my head. So I had to write a horse poem.
Oh, I'm glad you did. That's not my rule about the horses.
I know, it was good for the horse.
Sandy, one of the thoughts I'm having as you're talking about these particular poems that are spread out through this book, if you look, I mean, I know we're only looking at this one book, but many of us are familiar with her body of work. She's always written in series, numbered, poems that have numbered sections. A poem like October, which was a chapbook from Sarah Band Books many years ago, and then it's included, I think, maybe in a Verno, that book. But even prior to that, so as a structure for thinking, taking up an idea or an image or situation, a feeling, that the series as a shape is maybe one of the things that is just natural to her. I don't know, but maybe that's one of the gifts of her work to us. Gives us a way of seeing how you can take up and start something and okay, I finished that. No, number 2. There's another one and another one and another one, and throughout a whole lifetime of writing poems, one might, you know, still do these series or begin to see one's poems as part of a larger series.
Now that's really a good observation. And I'm looking through her Wild Iris right now, which is all pretty short poems. But it's funny that there are several of them with the same titles.
Yeah.
So
Titles,
Matins,
Vespers, and yeah.
Matins, and so it's like she hasn't quite finished with this, and so here's another one. But yeah, it's she really likes to. Oh, there's at least four called Matins in the Wild Iris.
Yeah.
Like she just keeps ruminating over an idea that even if the poems aren't the same, they have the feeling of Matins to her. I mean, there are other poems that are similarly named with the others, and it's just like Vesper. Oh, here's Vespers, and there's like 5 of those. But it's like I have this idea, and this idea is connected to this word in lots of different ways. So
Maybe I had not thought about this before you were saying Vespers and Matins, but that really means if we look through everything she's done, we'd probably find that light and dark running all the way through every book.
Yeah.
It's certainly prominent in this one.
Yeah.
You know, KB, as you're talking, I'm also thinking of how, well, I hope I don't lose my train of thought here, but I was thinking about the ways in which she, you know, there's no great way to say this. I'm just kind of stumbling through it, but I'm thinking of the ways in which she will have a similar beginning to a poem. You know, like in A Sharply Worded Silence, let me tell you something, said the old woman. And if you go back through her work, you know, in Ararat, I'll tell you something, in a poem called Fantasy. Every day people are dying. And that's just the beginning. But let me tell you something. I'll tell you something. Mock Orange, it's not the moon, I tell you. So the phrasing, or not phrasing, but that clause, I tell you, I will be telling you, I have told you, that language becomes its own series on a sort of writ large, in some sense, throughout her work. And what does the telling mean? You know, the telling, oh, what was it we were talking about, Sandy, right before the beginning with the, was that kind of phrasing? Oh yeah, the beginning of Faithful and Virtuous Night. My story begins very simply. Obviously, story itself is a kind of telling, right? Mm-hmm. I could speak and I was happy. Or I could speak, thus I was happy. Or I was happy, thus speaking. So, you know, a series might be syntactical, if that makes any sense. It keeps emerging out of language that keeps getting rewritten and revised and reshuffled. Anyway.
yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and I'm looking through the first 4 books of her poems, and a lot of them start like in media res. I mean, like she's continuing a conversation with you. There's one that starts, and yet I've lived like this for years. Like, what? Where did that just come from? And then another one begins, you see, they have no judgment. Okay, is this from something earlier that we've been talking about? And so it's very interesting. So now I have to go back through the new one, this new one too. This is a new one for me, and see if those beginnings are also like that.
And a lot of those beginnings may be continuations, like Afterwards was the continuation from the poem before.
Yeah,
I haven't connected the dots yet.
Yeah.
Put in the middle of the book, by the way, Afterward. wait, wait a minute. I remember when I came across that in the middle of the book, I thought, that's kind of,
Old.
why is she doing, why is she doing that? I mean, I loved it. But maybe all language is an afterword for her. I don't know. I think, gosh, there's so many thoughts that you have as you try, and you can't even kind of grapple with all of them. But I think the very first poem in this book, I have a lot of, as I'm sure some of you do as well, I have a lot of favorite Louise Gluck poems or Glick poems. I have a lot of favorite poems of hers. But I remember reading this first poem when the book came out 6 or 7 years ago, and just being stopped, like, wow, this is a poem. This is a major poem to me on her part. And I think a lot of it has to do with the authority of that first line. First, divesting ourselves of worldly goods, as St. Francis teaches. And I want to enter into that word divesting as a kind of metaphor for what she is doing, what her poems are trying to do. How do they, how does the self divest itself? How does the voice, how does the story, how does our telling divest itself of whatever it needs to be divested of? And sometimes that may be even purpose. The ending of this is great as well, right? Was anybody else taken with this poem? And it's so wonderful that it's called Parable.
It stands alone. It's outside the rest of the work, outside the rest of the volume to me. And it's ironic it's the first poem, but it doesn't do what the rest of them do in that circular. To me, it's unlike any of the other poems, and that's not why I like it so much. I was blown away when I read it too, Jeff. It stopped me, and I almost had trouble continuing to read the rest of the poems because I kept coming back to it. Yes, that last line. The last line. Just.
Yeah, this is
Yes.
I see it as very much connected, Karen, to the book. It in the sense that she has a kind of trope where there are two sides. I mean, this is what argument is, right? So in argument, you've got these two sides, and you see this throughout her body of work. If you go back to Meadowlands, she'll have these poems where like somebody's asking a question and then there's an answer, and then there's a question and an answer and a question and an answer. One person on one side, or later in this book, you've got the speaker and then the analyst. So there's always this larger argument that we're involved in, and a poem like this has these two groups. First, divesting ourselves in order that our souls not be distracted by gain and loss, and in order also that our bodies be free to move easily at the mountain passes. We had then to discuss whither or where we might travel, and the second question being, should we have a purpose? Against which many of us argued fiercely that such purpose corresponded to worldly goods. Well, that's interesting. You got to think about that for a while. Just having a purpose is wanting something. It's gain. It's meaning a limitation or constriction. Whereas others said it was by this word we were consecrated pilgrims rather than wanderers. What a wonderful line break. Because on one level, well, the word consecrated, is it Is it the verb that goes along with were? Or is it a predicate adjective? Or wait a minute, it's an adjective that goes with the word pilgrims. I get to read it 3 ways for a moment. But yeah, and then at the end, of course, and those who believed we should have a purpose believed this was the purpose. And those who felt we must remain free in order to encounter truth felt it had been revealed. So it's like both camps have some kind of confirmation.
Right.
I thought this poem was suggesting a way to read the book. That, I felt like she was addressing me as a reader. My disposition might be this or it might be that, but that this was sort of a parable for how to read her poems. And so I treated the poems as I read them. Somebody said they felt like the poems were floating or they were floating over them. And I felt that way a lot. But I felt, and I truth in advertising here, I only had time to read the book all the way through. So I didn't do the study that you've done, Sandy. And I think I need to, because it clearly bears repeating. But I just thought each poem was sort of, I read it sort of allegorically. So
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Annette, that I think this first poem sets us up for all the other poems for the
Yeah.
book's journey. And
yeah,
because it's about like, what is really the meaning of life? And when you think about that adage, the journey is the destination. You guys have heard that? That kind of, to me, speaks to this book. Look, how are you looking at the journey?
But she uses that word in
As
this poem.
Yeah, she does.
Yeah, toward the very bottom of page 3, but always that moment passed. So after many years, we were still at that first stage, still preparing to begin a journey, but we were changed nevertheless. We could see this in one another. We had changed, although we never moved. And one said, "Ah, behold how we have aged, traveling from day to night only, neither forward nor sideward. And this seemed in a strange way miraculous." Yeah, I love that. I love that poem. And it seems that toward the very, I don't want to say the end of her career, but because I think she has another book forthcoming, and and hopefully another 5. Who knows? I hope she, lives to 100 like Stanley Kunitz. But I think about this book's first poem, and then the previous book, if you don't know it, A Village Life. Same thing. Like the first poem in that book, and that whole book, by the way, is an achievement. I know there are people who love her earlier work, and I do also, but I think these last 2 books have been, like, wow. Wow. These are fantastic books.
National Book Award worthy.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Jeff, I was just thinking when you pointed out the word divest, because this is the first poem that I read. This book was a gift for my birthday. Thank you, Karen Pinterest. Anyway, when I read I love the word divest, and since it was the first one, and of course I did not. I've already told you, just like Annette, I haven't poured over and studied. Boy, I'm going to now. I have, of course, read everything in here, and some of them more than once, but it does seem to me, and I didn't realize it till now, I could tell something that was going on with her, because every time she would be trying to tell me that she was somebody else. Of course, when I started every poem, I was thinking, I'm learning something about her in this poem, even though the speaker doesn't sound like it's her because it's not a woman. So it feels now, looking at that, reminding me of a song one of us called When I Was a Boy, that I thought was a brilliant song that a young songwriter did years and years ago. And if you don't know it, just look it up and hear it. when I was a boy. It's amazing. But that she was trying to divest herself through every one of these poems, trying somehow trying to, not trying, she was actually doing it, being someone else or somewhere else. Or anyway, I think it's interesting that she used the word divest, because
Well,
she could have been doing that with herself.
yeah, I mean, I think about how, throughout the last, 4 decades roughly, or maybe a little bit more. When's her first book? 1980, not 1979, I forget. But no, 1968. I'm sorry. I think her first book's called Firstborn, came out in 1968. I should remember this. It's when I was born. But
Spring chicken.
but yeah, I know. I prefer the term whippersnapper. But now I think about how, she's been a poet for whom the ins and outs and the intricacies of selfness, or myself or self, has been what she's written about. With all the, problems of that, and all the wonders of that. I mean, I think anybody who makes that their subject matter, or at least part of the subject matter, it comes with its inherent problems. But again, what she's been able to bring to American poetry and to the conception of what a poem can be, is really, really wonderful.
Yeah. Well, let's talk
but,
about. Sorry, KB, did you have something?
Well, I was just gonna say, I don't want to be hurled into the everlasting fires for saying this, but I'm gonna go ahead and throw this out there. I mean, a lot of her earlier poems are the shorter ones, and these later poems seem to get longer. And I just wonder, when I look at Faithful and Virtuous Night, I personally don't like the poem as a whole, but I have a lot of sections that I've got things starred and underlined. And so just having gone through an MFA program where all the professors lauded her, hung out with her, and knowing that a lot of you guys teach creative writing in college, I just feel like if I had turned this poem in, Faithful and Virtuous Night, as is, that I would have a lot of things cut out of it. And I just wondered if anybody else thought that way, or is that just me because I don't like long poems per se? But just throwing that out there. Don't throw me into the lake of fire or anything. It's just wondering.
I think you answered your own question, KB.
Yeah, I thought about that as somebody who just started writing, in 2017, 18. So I'm still pretty new to the game. Sometimes and I know that there are lots of kinds of poetry, right? I do know that. But I kept noticing that she was telling me a lot of things and using the verb to be a lot. And then there was a magical quality to the book overall, but individual poems like KB, sometimes I thought it faded in and out, and I couldn't tell because I only read the book once, whether it was actually more masterful and skillful than I was getting it credit for or not. But I was pretty sure that if I submitted a poem like this, I wouldn't get it accepted. That there's a certain reputation that she has and a certain achievement in this book that allows her to write in some ways that I think a new poet without a reputation, wouldn't be able to. Probably also, though, there's more accomplishment to this book than an individual. If I picked one of these individual poems out and pretended like I was going to send it out, I mean, so I do. And they were pretty long poems. I don't really mind long poems, KB, but but I did have some of that feeling, and I kind of hoped we would talk about that a little bit.
Amen, sister. I mean, yeah, there were several poems I thought, This reads like somebody's journal entry. They were so discursive. And yeah, I just thought, oh, this, I want to take my pen to it and just start doing some editing here. I thought, what am I missing? Am I missing something? Because she has such a stellar reputation.
Well,
You notice I have
in
been
here
silent through
also.
most of this, seriously.
I was also surprised at the simplicity with which she would describe something. But I think it takes a certain mastery to pull that off. I also was surprised that she has a lot of very simple declarations like smell the air, perhaps I slept, we sat in silence, or the night progressed, and all these short sentences that she had. But like I said, I think it takes a certain mastery to pull that off.
That would not be my issue with the things I didn't like here. I'm a great fan of simplicity. It is the sort of grandiose abstractions that really, and I too thought, yeah, okay, so we can study it, we can work at it, we can make it mean, we can see all the connections, which are certainly multifarious. But would we do it if it didn't have her name on it? Plus this very handy little thing on the cover, which certainly adds
Yes.
cachet. I mean, I will tell you frankly, I mean, there are beautiful lines in here, but they are drowned in a sea of very prosy lines. I was underwhelmed.
Yeah.
Well, I think we could all agree that reputation and past achievement speaks a lot to what's considered brilliant. When we're reading any book from Louise Gluck is going to be the majority of people are going to think this is a stellar book because she's won the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, the Nobel Prize. I mean, that's just honors speak in a lot of ways.
Well, and I think, of course, as I'm sorry, as you get more publishing and you get more books under your belt and more awards under your belt, you also gain a bit of freedom to do what you might feel like doing rather than what might be by the book. So she's like, or earned her wings, so to speak.
She made me feel and she made me think. And she does talk about possible meanings, but she never says this is exactly what this means. Oh, her sensual imagery is very strong, so that from time to time you're in that particular place with her with those particular objects. But as far as interpreting it, she leaves things very open-ended. And like I said, she made me feel, she made me think.
I really admire the in-betweenness on so many levels. The in-betweenness of dark and light, of staying in memory versus voyaging out. And what feels like wakingness versus a dreamlike state, that floating feeling. And almost, I think purgatory has a kind of a bad connotation, but it's almost a feeling between heaven and earth, between life and death somehow, that some of it feels like an afterlife or something, where she's left her body, an out-of-body experience or something. And there's just a lot that it's intriguing, and she does the same thing with the language, like starting in the middle, coming in right in the middle there at the beginning, which is that in-betweenness, which is just intriguing. And it kind of draws you in, like Alice said. So
I agree. Do you remember, I don't know which poem it was, but she's on a stairwell, or there's someone on a stairwell and there's a mother and a child, and they don't know if this person was going up or down. And I thought that is the essence of the book for me. This kind of that's why I feel like I'm floaty all the time. Is
Mm-hmm.
is it alive? Is it dead? Is it up or is it down? Is it real or is it imaginary? And I did really admire that about the book.
Mhm.
There's another poem like that. I'm thinking of The Open Window, about the writing, where the writer starts with the word the end, and then the wind comes in and
Oh,
scatters.
yeah.
the film.
Yes.
That it was
A
beautiful.
little prose piece.
That was so
Yeah.
cool.
Like the line in a sharply worded silence in the first stanza on page 20, the last line, barely able to make out in darkness the glittering knob. I think we've all been there when you're trying to open your door in the dark and you
Yes.
can't find the keyhole, but you see the light bounce off of the surface of the knob.
Or in a dream.
I mean, it was just like so trance-like, or in between, being able to recognize the shape and that's the theme of this whole book, is going back and forth between reality and dream. And it's just, what is the plan here? I mean, I'm in for what we do, but like I said, I think you could study this for so long. I mean, I'm one of those people that can dig down into one line for a year. So I don't, that's like Jeff and Sherry and maybe Sandy knows this too, but that I like to edit and revise poems my whole life. I won't write very many of them as a consequence, but I could study her lines and do prompts for days and weeks on just some of these lines. Are just so intense and rich. Do we want to, is it that you're going to propose we study one book for a while, or are we going to read once a month? I couldn't remember what
The books change every month.
every month. Oh my God.
Beyond
Okay.
This discussion here.
Yeah.
Within, one could say in our Facebook page, we can still
discuss it.
Yeah, we could discuss. That hasn't been necessarily what we've done, but I mean, it's always an option. People have questions or comments. But yeah, I think the sort of interplay between going back and forth between opposites. I think a kind of major thing in her work is feeling versus intellect, or analysis, perhaps, or maybe even psychoanalysis. I don't know necessarily. I sometimes wonder if she trusts feeling.
I
And
heard
that feeling.
the reviewers of her Nobel win described her as austere, and I think that that's accurate. I mean, I didn't really think she struggles with that, but like I think Alice said this, that she made you feel and she makes you think. Even if she's not feeling, I'm feeling. I mean, I don't know. I don't know her and have never met her, but
I think she feels deeply.
I answer personal questions. I kind of pick up on that just from whether she's choosing a narrator, and this is, has no biographical, reality to it whatsoever. It's up to her to do that, but it's just.
Before you guys got here, Sandy and I were talking, and I was pointing out on page 16 in that title poem, at the top of the page, there's a stanza where she says, "I was content with my brooding. I spent my days with the colored pencils. I soon used up the darker colors. Though what I saw, as I told my aunt, was less a factual account of the world than a vision of its transformation subsequent to passage through the void of myself." And I felt that there's something really telling about that passage. I know it's in this persona, but I still see it as accurate to her work, almost as though the self is this prism through which everything else has come, but there's a starkness, there's an emptiness, there's a kind of wondering whether there is purpose, or whether there is, any kind of revelation, anything that's being revealed at all, to echo back to that opening poem.
Or even whether there is a person. Sometimes
Yeah.
that's what I got.
Jeff, I'm glad that you've gone back to the South twice now, and I'm glad you came back to it because it's very Buddhist like, because the Buddhists talk about the self, not that there's not a self, but they talk about emptiness, not that there's nothing there, but that it's boundless, and therefore there's connection to everything. So I kind of get that feeling of this boundless self, even though she's talking about the void, that sort of is an openness, such touching everything.
Think about the little prose poem with the fortune teller, where what's the ending of that? Something like everything, you're holding hands with a fortune teller. Everything is hypothesis, and I forget what the other word is, but
Dream.
And dream. Yes, and dream.
and dream. Yeah.
Yeah.
Theory of memory.
Yeah.
Right now, you are a child holding hands with a fortune teller, and there's so much with child or children. Children coming home from school. That's a poem I remember from Ararat, her book from many years ago.
And aging and looking back as an older person back to being a child, like that the English painter persona was looking back in Faithful and Virtuous Night when he was a child and these things happened. And theory of memory, looking back too. Because the first thing is long, long ago, before I was a tormented artist, I was this child. So there's this like pull between being a child and being older and seeing the end of things while remembering the beginning of things. So talk about cyclical and circular. I think that occurs a lot too. But what did y'all think about the prose? So we talked about these persona character poems, but there are several prose poems in here. Did anybody have a particular thought on one of those, or anything you want to talk about the prose poems?
I liked the prose poems a lot better than the others. Their titles were sometimes a bit baffling.
Yeah.
A work of fiction or utopia.
Yeah. They were very fable-like. A lot of them were like fables to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, very dream-like and kind of hard to.
They have like sort of dream logic, like in the Utopia, where that one line, her hair has been tightly braided to withstand the journey, right? So it gives all this agency to the tightening of the braid. They're just
Love that. Yeah.
like that.
Why then is it called Utopia?
Still working on that one. I mean, it had such nice concrete imagery. It was so followable. It was so non-sprawly. But what the hell with Utopia?
I thought another Matins or Vespers would be fine with me because I didn't get Utopia with this poem. And the same with The Sword and the Stone. If anybody would please explain that title with that poem, I would love to hear it.
That one's a little easier.
Well, the Utopia is just no place, right? So maybe.
Oh, I thought Utopia was the perfect place.
It's the journey itself, I think. Seems to be.
And it says, the child asked, is it the right train? It will be the right train, said the woman, because it is the right time. And that to me speaks of all those things we do, not knowing how it's going to come out, but the train's there and it's the right time. And so we get on. And I don't know, that's not necessarily Utopia. I'm still puzzled by the title, but I like the idea that the child gets on the train because the train's there and it's the right time to do that. That speaks to me of the life journey a lot.
Right.
I don't know. This is probably a stretch about the sword and the stone, but I was just thinking about the metaphor. There's such a message in there about being seen and witnessed, like the being watched by the analyst, and there's something that happens in there that seems powerful. And then at the very end, when he's walking home with a little wine, he says, "It's the critics." He says, "The critics have the ideas. We artists, he included me, are just children at our games," which brings it back to that mind versus feeling, mind versus play, or something.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
I want to ask a question about utopia because I feel stupid here. And when I read that poem, I thought the moan or the cry was because the grandmother was standing right there and could not believe that her granddaughter had entered the right train at the right time with the gift for her. And that was the moan or the cry that we heard. Did anyone else think that? Am I stupid to think that?
No.
Anyway.
Also, like the train whistle leaving, you know, it's pulling away.
Yeah, the train is making the sound. That's what I.
Yeah.
Country music, that long, lonesome whistle.
It's lonesome, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the train from which a strange sound comes, something more like a moan or a cry. Yeah. But it, you know, there still is that interrupting phrase of not in a language like the one she speaks, which is still, I mean, this speaks to what you talk about, Karen. You know, like you can take a line or a phrase or a statement in this poet's work, or anybody's, I suppose, but especially here, and it seems to reverberate into so many other places in her work. You know, there is a desire for, I mean, there's the conversation that goes on between the written and the unwritten, and it seems as though the unwritten always has precedent, right? It's bigger, it's has more possibility.
And
Or there's the fear that one will never write again, and that all of the unwritten will, you know, wash over what one has written.
I like the last prose poem, and it's the last one in the book, and it connects to what you're saying, Jeff, because the last line is, "This must explain the puzzling music coming from the trees." And I like that because it seems the speaker seems to be observing the couple, and it could be this or it could be that. But when at another time they might be strangers about to meet by accident, she drops her book, stooping to pick it up. She touches by accident his hand, and her heart springs open like a child's music box. I just love that. And then the whole thing about the block of wood and the dancer, and then she's a dancer of some kind, not simply a block of wood. This must explain the puzzling music coming from the trees. I thought that was just a lovely way to end the book. But that sort of mystery, there's so much mystery in that, and it can't be articulated.
Yeah, and even the question that's in earlier in that piece, how does one know?
Yeah, how does one know? It could be
and
this, it could be that.
There's so much of that. I mean, even the analyst poem that we were talking about earlier is still, you know, the mind is always at work and clicking and trying to observe and understand, and there's the artifice, the games that we're all part of. The you know, we're just artists. We make up our little games. But even that poem with the analyst, the way that it begins, that I love the opening of that, where she seems to be so aware. My analyst looked up briefly, it's page 38. Naturally, I couldn't see him, but I had learned in our years together to intuit these movements. There's a kind of intimacy, I think, there. As usual, he refused to acknowledge whether or not I was right. I'm not sure whether that's supposed to be funny or serious. My ingenuity versus his evasiveness, our little game.
And near the end of that poem, I love that line, "The wine had gone to my head." Like, again, it's not something that can be fully accounted for or described, but also the head, because the analysis, the psychoanalysis that's going on here and so forth. I just thought that was a really genius little moment. And I mean, it's like a cliche, but not in this context.
Well, on page 41, that discussion that goes back and forth, right? He was a writer. His many novels at the time were much praised. One was much like another, and yet his complacency disguised suffering. That whole conversation to me echoes back to the beginning poem of the book with purpose, trying to have achievement in the world, all that type of stuff. I mean, as poets, I mean, we obviously want to find a readership. We want our work to last, but at some point we have to kind of give up that desire. Is that even the right question? I mean, the likelihood is no. So now there's freedom.
So it's a little after 8, so I want to kind of finish up here. Did anybody have a poem that you would call your favorite?
Yes. It's the one, it's a summer garden.
Yes, me too, Alice. What did you like about it?
I don't know if I can put it in words exactly. She starts with that picture and is dusting off the memories, and then they come. She says a word came into my head referring to this shifting and changing, these erasures that were now obvious. It appeared and as quickly vanished. Was it blindness or darkness, peril, confusion? Summer arrived, then autumn, the leaves turning, the children bright spots in a mesh of bronze and sienna. And then when I'd recovered somewhat from these events, I'd replaced the photograph as I'd found it. And she winds up putting it back into a translation of Death in Venice. And she says, I noted the page in case, as Freud believed, nothing is an accident. Thus, the little photograph was buried again, as the past is buried. And I think that was really the point for me. The past is buried in the future. And then we're back to the garden in the next section. And she says how quiet it is now that life has triumphed. And she spends the time describing it. And in the middle of the sky, the immodest God. Things are, he says. They are. They do not change. Response does not change. How hushed it is. The stage as well as the audience. It seems breathing is an intrusion. He must be very close. The grass is shadowless. How quiet it is, how silent, like an afternoon in Pompeii. And then that's where in the next section, Mother died last night, Mother who never dies. And she does winter is in the air, but then she goes into what is obviously spring. The song, How Alone I Am, songs of that sort. Oh, aromas drifted out of the earth, the dishes were in the sink. Very, very small daily things. And under the full moon, Maria was folding the washing. Oh, it was the 10th of May, as it had been the night, the 8th. Mother slept in her bed, her arms outstretched, her head balanced between them. And it's this conflating of time, I think, more than anything else, but as if the layers of time are simultaneous in a way. I don't know why I liked it. What do you like to say, me?
Yeah, I loved so much of the language,
liked it too.
and especially that third section, which I thought was just beautiful. But you know, the whole thought of memory, like discovering this photograph, and then all of these things kind of flooding from that. I don't know. I've just found it kind of gentle and just really lovely, and kind of a break from some of the other things that confused me with some of the other poems. You know, I just really latched onto that one as one that I liked. I also
It
liked,
seemed less obscure somehow.
yes, true. And the couple in the park, I like that one too. We already talked about that one a little bit.
Yeah.
Linda, what was your favorite?
I loved Aboriginal landscape. Again, the thing between life and death, and I mean, the beginning is so wonderful. You're stepping on your father, my mother said. Even though she's dead too, right? You know,
Yep.
it's that playing with time that I so admire.
He also throws in these little jabs of humor
Mhm.
like that. Like the doctor even, you know, agreed, or the doctor had admitted it.
Right,
And,
right.
well, the doctor had admitted it. That there's like 2 or 3 or 4 times that something was like, is that like making a little joke here?
And in that poem, there's also the conductor is almost like is sort of a godlike figure or a spirit guide. You know, she says, "Do not forget me." And when at last I reached him, "Madam," he said, pointing to the tracks, "surely you realize this is the end. The tracks do not go farther." So it's again that journey, and I don't know, I'm just sort of, I love the play between life and death, that afterlife or otherworldliness, the veil going. The older I get, the veil seems to be thinner, you know, all the time. So I'm just
You know,
drawn.
Linda, that's another poem where there's that sense of conversation between two, you know, so there's the analyst, there's the train conductor, there's
Mhm.
the other author who's the novelist. You know, there's the older brother, and the other poem, the aunt. You know, there's always something on the other side. And so, you know, even the first poem, as we talked about, has the two different groups of people. I just think that's how she thinks, or at least in this book. But I see evidence of it in other poems of hers throughout her body of work.
And could be also different parts of herself. You know, there's the shadow that we all have, and that kind of. It's fascinating.
Yeah, like who is the you? You know, I tell you, or I mean, there's that kind of language which has always been present in her work. So who is that you? So is it the audience? Is it the culture?
There was a poem where the you left the indention of the head on the pillow. What poem was that?
It was one of the early poems. Oh. An adventure, page 6, in the beginning of the middle of section 6.
Right, you had been with me.
Mm-hmm.
The dent in the second pillowcase. Yeah, I was like, where did that come from? It's interesting. And I don't have a good answer for it. I'm just saying I noticed it.
You know, one of the prose poems that nobody's mentioned is The Open Window on 44. This is the one that has the elderly writer had formed this habit of writing the words "the end" on a piece of paper before he began his stories. So I love the premise of that idea, and then the way in which that gets reshuffled later in that prose poem. I think the last sentence says, "And he lay on the cold floor of the study, watching the wind stirring the pages, mixing the written and unwritten, the end among them." So not before, not the afterword. It's just mixed in. You know, death. Well, actually, even in the poem on page 6 that you were talking about, we had escaped from death. You know, oh, it's already mixed in. So,
Yeah, I think we could find interesting things. Like Karen said, we read this book for a year. You're still going to discover, discover more and more and more things. And who knows, maybe Beth and Catherine might be swing over and be huge fans.
Stranger things have happened.
I liked several of the poems, but yeah, I was really surprised at her writing style in some of them.
Yeah.
you know, it occurs to me, you know, what you might kind of consider is, you know, as you read somebody like her, you know, as a writer ourselves, we could ask ourselves, well, what is it possible for me to get away with?
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes that's how we do it. I mean, we're just writing to try to see, you know, can I have this language that is almost, you know, I mean, her poetry has a lot of declarative statements, or in this book, there are a lot of declarative statements. If I'm aware of that, it's not, I don't think I even ask the question like, you know, is this good or bad, or, you know, do I like this or not like this? I'm always thinking, at what level, where's the line? You know, like, where do you cross the line and it's like too much, or if she succeeds, where does she succeed and why? And then of course the next day, the place I thought she succeeded, I read it and go, you know, and then this other place that I overlooked, whoa, you know, that comes out. But that's maybe one way to approach any of these authors that we read.
Yeah, and I think, oh, go ahead, Annette.
I was going to say, you and Jeff did arrange for Louise Gluck to join us for the last 30 minutes, right?
So that we can ask her all these questions and make her
Yeah.
herself.
Love us.
No.
She says she would be able to be with us in 2028. So
She's booked.
she's booked up.
All right. Does anybody have anything else that you want to say about this book?
I want to say I'm glad you chose it.
Yeah.
Anyone who can do this magical stuff to me in one reading, there were places where emotion just suddenly, out of something that seemed like she was not going to share really any definitive feeling that she's got really about anything, it's just going to, then boom, there would be something for me. That's the way it was. And I was just, so I'm glad you chose it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we Jeff and I talked one time that we want to pick a book that at some point that the majority of people don't like, and see what kind of conversation that we get sometimes.
Well, I think it's important for us to look at prize-winning books to see what makes it a winner. Why this one out of a whole bunch of others?
Yeah.
You know, particularly with first book prizes and some of the bigger prizes where you see advertised, these competitions advertised in Poets and Writers all the time. What makes this book so special that it stood out among all these, you know, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of entries?
Yeah. You know, I'm sure there's a big conversation to have about that, but I would imagine, I mean, I've been someone who has judged a poetry contest, right? Not a book contest, but poetry. I've done that a few times. And I think almost any person who makes those choices feels like it was an utter failure. Like every time. I mean, for me, every time, like I've got to do a first, second, and third on this poetry contest. It's like, and I'm pretty sure catch me tomorrow and it'll reshuffle.
Yeah.
So I think that we all have to kind of understand that it's a lot of reshuffling probably. And it could go either way.
Who won the National Book Award when Natalie Diaz did not? I cannot remember that poet's name.
Choi, Choi.
Yeah, Asian.
Yep.
Okay, well, I bought that book. It's nearly impossible to read. It's so bizarre. Like, we need to probably put that on our list just so there's one that is going to be really fun. Like I was thinking, how in the world did this book win over Natalie Diaz's book? Like,
Anything could have. And I haven't gotten it just because I was rooting for Diaz all the way on that one.
Darn it. Yeah. Well, we should give that book a chance. Okay, so let's move on then. February, we have this book coming up. Mesmerizingly, sadly beautiful, Matthew Lipman.
That's an ambitious title.
I know.
Yeah.
It'd be fun.
Well, there's another one of his books called American Chew. And then Salami Jew, I have somewhere here. I've got, I think, pretty much all of his books. He's quirky. And
I like quirky.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna see if I can get him to come.
Oh,
I don't know him.
you want me to contact him?
You know him?
No, I don't know him, but we know a lot of the same people.
Yeah, I know some of the same people too. I mean, we're Facebook friends.
Okay.
What that means it.
Y'all are tight.
Yeah, we're one of my
So you're saying we should be
my
circumspect.
non-friend friend. I've never met it. Yeah, so we'll see about that. February 16th, Matthew Lipman. And I guess that's all, guys. Thank you for coming and talking about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job. Take care.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
KB, some of these poems, KB, are actually 2 pages. So
If you're reading somebody with 10 pages, 2's going to be rocking.
yeah, I think most of them are 2 pages, but there might be a 1-pager in here.
You noticed that my favorite poem was only a 1-page long one, right?
Oh, well, actually, I loved the very beginning of the book. There was that one little poem that was 1 page, The Past.
That's the one I like. That's my favorite one.
I like that poem too.
All right. Good night. Thanks, guys.
All right. See
Good
y'all.
night. Good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good one.
All right. See y'all.
Bye.